So we moved to Asheville recently, maybe 7 months ago now, in order to start doing design work in a community that we would feel more connected with than living in San Francisco, Chicago, Boston, New York, all these big hubs that have a lot of job opportunities, but everything felt very like artificial. No one really stayed around too long, so nothing ever felt like it was going to really stabilize into something that would have a long-term goal for us. So I think here's been a great place for us so far, and now we have an office space in the Collider. We have a 6-month kind of lease, but I think it's going to last longer because we're really enjoying it. And we just bought a house, so now we're super committed to the environment. Yeah, so before that, I was living, well, first, here's a picture of me to start things off with a mustache, which I think is always kind of a good icebreaker. This was also in Durham, so kind of in the North Carolinian regions. But here's our logo. We have a lot of different colors, and we can get into that later, but this was kind of one of the main colors that we ended up sticking with as the primary focal, because we think the pink really stuck out as a huge statement compared to a lot of other agencies out there, and it has this nice punch to it. So for now, it will be that way, but as you'll find out later in this talk, things will evolve with brands, and that's kind of fun too. So I grew up in Rhode Island. I don't know how many of you have been to Rhode Island, but this is kind of what a lot of people imagine Rhode Island to be. And you're not wrong in certain areas, but then we also have Providence, Rhode Island, where we have the great Buddy Cianci, which I did not grow up there exactly. Pawtucket, where there's the baseball team that moves up to the Red Sox, which we felt a little special about, but they have this wacky polar bear, which in its own way has its weird brand. But I grew up in Newport, Rhode Island, where that guy from the beginning kind of lives, because a lot of yachts and such and lighthouses, but they're known for beaches, mansions, boats, and then it turns out I am that guy. So I'm living here now in the mountains, kind of escaping the beaches, but I do feel kind of separated from the ocean. But that's a little introduction to myself. And then getting into branding, I don't know about y'all, but the paper is going to be part of this, getting into where we all grew up and what brands we were surrounded by and how that affected our future kind of like establishment of what a brand is. So some of my earliest brand memories are from things from my childhood, like toys. So I bought a lot of Masters of the Universe, G.I. Joe, Transformers, which kind of at the time I didn't think anything of it, but these brands are incredibly powerful, and someone went through a huge process to actually develop what's going to market to a child, and it worked. So these are still brands that I think are super iconic, and now they've evolved into Transformers with movies, G.I. Joe with movies. Also, cartoons had a huge impact on me growing up. So things like The Simpsons, Pokemon, Turtles, they also have a huge, powerful brand idea behind them, and they've built this identity with characters, voices, style, and all of that is part of a brand. Movies, Star Wars, which I have a tattoo on my right arm, but also Jaws, Jurassic Park, plethora of others, but they all have very distinct logo marks, colors, styles, tones of voice. And then there's kind of that tagline in a lot of them too, like in the Jaws of the terrifying motion picture from the terrifying #1 bestseller, which not super catchy, but it's written on like all the posters for some reason. And it sort of became a tagline. So there was also games and the style and branding of things like Pac-Man, Mario Brothers, and Sonic the Hedgehog, all creating this distinct, unique feel amongst each other. Books. So I grew up reading Harry Potter, Goosebumps, and the less cool one in my mind now, the Animorphs. But it was an early adoption of Photoshop. There's also something super neat about along the way the brands had chosen to, in the Harry Potter and Goosebump realms, create like texture on top of the actual type that's on the book, which is kind of a nice extra addition to the brand. Comics. We have the old Batman, Spider-Man, Wonder Woman, which has some really nice typefaces. But it's also a brand that's evolved, as you've seen in like movies now, in a crazy, more industrial, metallic way. And then I love metal, and I think metal has some of the best branding for its various names and such because all the fonts are super customized. So even if you're not into metal, there's an appreciation in design for metal type. And they have their own like typefaces now and such too. So this all leads to the initial icebreaker, which is sort of knowing what brands affected you growing up and maybe not what you're looking at now, but like, what do you remember growing up as a child were brands around your house, around your childhood? And this is the area where you can just yell them out. You don't necessarily have to write down anything, but awesome. I also had a lot of Camel Joe stuff from my dad sending in like the tabs from the cigarettes, like Marlboros, you could get hats and stuff. So I just went to school with Marlboro hats, which was very weird. Anyone else? Certain type of clothing? Awesome. Yep. Were you aware of those at the time? Or was it just like a thing that's on stuff? Yeah. But you didn't know why. They just were awesome. That's sweet. Was that a thing that the city implemented? Or so that's an awesome way of doing branding, which then kind of after these icebreakers, we'll get into the definition of what branding is. And that kind of is very much along this like middle ground of what branding is. But I already said that. The icebreaker part 2 is what the paper is for, which there's been this sort of like online fun activity of people trying to draw different popular brands, how best they remember them, and see how close they are to actually capturing what those brands look like. And so I'd love for you all to take like a few minutes to just try to draw some of your favorite brands based on memory and nothing else, and see how close we can actually capture what they might look like. This also goes out for anyone at home who wants to participate. You can post them online. I have a separate thing where I draw with my left hand to embarrass myself. So it's kind of got that vibe going for it. Also, if you really want to push it to the limit, try to see where the type goes in relation to the logo mark. This is like the whole criminal investigation where you can remember who the person's face actually looked like. Or McDonald's might be a W. Or like, I think the most fun one is trying to draw the Ghostbusters logo. Give it another like 30 seconds or so. Sounds like beautiful works of art are happening. No, I'm holding them as potential future shirt ideas because they're not going to look well enough that I can get sued. I hope. This mic makes me feel very presidential. Okay, and I'll call it here. So the next step is if you would share it with your neighbor and see if they can guess what it is. So how many people nailed it? How many people nailed the logo? Cool, it worked. So how many people nailed the logo or knew exactly what they want? Nice. What were they? Okay. Nice. Clothing. New Balance and Converse star. Any other clothings? Cool. Also as a star, right? Okay. So based on that, the last part of this icebreaker series is me just scrolling through different logos and then having everyone yell out, assuming you all know them, because you probably should if you're in America, but we'll find out. Ding. 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 Nailed it. Yep. Yep. So that all leads into what is a brand? And I started with definitions to find out what the world thinks the brand is. And it's evolved, it turns out. So first one, a mark made by burning with a hot iron to attest manufacturer quality or to designate ownership. That's a pretty aggressive way of thinking of branding, but it comes from a historic statement, which kind of leads to where branding has become a very pop culture and modern day society thing. Definition 2, a mark put on criminals with a hot iron. Kind of similar, but evolved a little bit. Definition 3, a mark of disgrace, stigma. That's not what you want your company to have. Definition 4, a class of goods identified by name as the product of a single firm or manufacturer. That sounds a bit more along the lines, but kind of complex for what it actually does. Definition 5, a public image, reputation, or identity can be conceived of as something to be marketed or promoted. All right, that sounds a little better, but it took 5 definitions from the dictionary to actually get to something that sounds like the modern day brand. So what's branding? The promotion of a product or service by identifying it with a particular brand. That sounds about right. And then what's a brand name? An arbitrarily adopted name that is given by a manufacturer or merchant to an article or service to distinguish it as produced or sold by that manufacturer or merchant, and that may be used and protected as a trademark. Sexy. So to brand, kind of questionable in certain ways. However, what I found out was the wiki way of saying branding made a lot more sense. A brand is an overall experience of a customer that has distinguished an organization or product from its rivals in the eyes of the customer. Brands are used in business, marketing, and advertising. That definitely sounds more legit. So I guess democracy of the people on Wikipedia decided to take the definition and make it more modern, and it makes a lot more sense. So to brand. So why create a brand? So why should you spend time crafting your brand? It's your recognition and identity. We all have a clear identity and voice in this world. So should your brand. A great brand knows who it is, which makes them stand out. I think he's a great standout. and fabulous. So much like a person with high self-confidence is going to stand out in a crowd, same goes for a brand. Always own what you are and who you are, first and foremost. People and clients will be able to tell. So your brand is not only the mark you share with the work and everything that mark represents, the employees, the culture, and the service. What sort of feeling that recognition is associated with, similar to watching a great movie and being able to recall who the director was or reading a good book and thinking fondly of that author. A great brand should conjure positive thoughts, and that's attached to all of these things. Consistency is also key, both from an experience standpoint and from a visual one. What I mean by this is the experience your users have while using your product should be consistent in color, tone, and navigation. That at least goes for the application realms, but in the traditional sense of print, more to do with the first. Think about it. If your friend or family member acts erratically all of a sudden, such as they start wearing Jinko jeans exclusively when they used to wear much slimmer, kind of nicer traditional jeans, you're gonna have some questions and feel a little stressed out as to what's going on. So if brands change, there's gonna be questions and there should be answers. Be consistent and be recognizable. And so that leads to how a brand is born. Yes, brands all look like this in the beginning before they get tarnished by new ownership. If you think about it, royalty has been stylishly showcasing their brand for hundreds of years, from the colors they use, the materials they choose to decorate with, and to their highly curated and prized family crest, which oftentimes is way more complex than necessary, but a lot of cooks are in that kitchen. So if basically the nightmare client that gives you a list that looks like this, well, that was the crazy crest. This is the nightmare client list of things that sometimes a designer can get and then try to make sense of. 1, I hate orange, red, and yellow. Oh, and green. 2, my family has a past with oranges, so we have to include an orange somewhere in there. Remember, no orange. 3, vines are cool too, I guess. Maybe lots of vines. Maybe no vines? I trust you. 4, the piece has to be square, include a shield, ship, water, and the family dog Mogwai. Oh, and it has to fit a triangle because we built a pyramid once. 5, O'Doyle rules. So we get something like this and then have to try to parse that information into something that makes sense. And either you can have a long conversation and devolve into what they actually might want, or you follow all these rules and you end up with this, the Maryland flag. So our way of dealing with this and our process at Clade is we always start with an intake form of some way. This is a blank one because I'm not going to share any NDA information, but we capture the client name, client team, everyone who's going to be reporting to, coming to meetings, etc., what the type of engagement is. In this case, it would be branding, or it's a larger project that includes branding. And then the timeline, so we can have a clear establishment set of how many weeks this is going to take, what the cost is going to be, and everyone can agree to everything in the beginning, so nothing gets too out of control. Also, there's a project summary, which is almost like continuing a mission statement. So we make sure that we're all on the same page throughout the entire process. And they all have access to this information, so they're always able to reflect back to it, make sure we're still following the same summary that we agreed to. And then Sarah there has built this wonderful timeline which really breaks down from the kickoff state into the design reviews. Depending on the length of the project, it can change week to week, depending on their timeline, depending on their availability. But here we try to capture all the best states and the tasks, what's expected of us at different times, and what's expected at the end of the entire project in a very concise, clean format. I'm gonna take a drink of water real quick. So the first meeting. We begin with a kickoff, which is usually just an hour-long kind of conversation to better understand what did they truly mean by that 5-point confusing thing. It's more just understanding what they're about, what their customers want, what kind of history they've had previously when developing their brand, what maybe negative experiences they've had building that brand that they haven't shared in that initial talk, and just getting down to business. It's kind of like a very intense first date. And in that first date, we try to capture a list of nouns that are actionable items related to what their brand is trying to capture. Because we found that verbs or things that are more emotionally attached have less opportunity to create a visual for the brand logo mark kind of material. And so getting them to narrow down, like, how do you associate what items to that specific emotion you're trying to capture will help us better create some sort of like visual imagery for what your brand is going to become. And then after that conversation goes down, we take all the notes we need to, we gather all this kind of analytical data based on what they can provide us. We go research ourselves and we compare it to all the other companies out there in the similar workspace. So in this case, if they're a restaurant or a coffee shop or something, we go look at every other restaurant and coffee shop, both locally and everywhere else, and try to understand how can we do something that's different, stand out, have a different color, different voice, whatever it is. Something should make them unique. So then meeting 2, we can provide a list of bullshit names. And by that, it's more just, we have to get a lot of different ideas down and kind of present them to keep the brainstorming going, because sometimes you can hit a wall where people shut down and get quiet. But if we're able to provide a lot of potential ideas and directions, along with the reasons behind why these names were actually being brainstormed based on our research, it can open up that conversation and continue for the next meeting. This will also include kind of a long, gobbledygook looking sketchbook where it's me just mind dumping a bunch of different directional ideas that could bring some opportunity, and at least continue that conversation as to which shapes might you actually be in love with that you didn't disclose initially. Maybe you like circles, maybe you don't like circles and you love the square, maybe you are not into dark things, but you didn't know it at first. So it's sort of just like an ongoing communication. And then from there, we can break down into which 3 directions from those sketches would you like to actually pursue and see evolved a little bit further. And they should be 3 very distinct directions so that you're not overlapping too much, and they can actually choose which of the 3 they want to go with. So then meeting 3. Once we've chosen which of those 3 directions was the one they felt most secure in and felt represented the brand best, we would take that one direction and then do a bunch of implementations of it to try to narrow it down even further, because maybe they liked it, but they had some reservations on how much the coffee was filled. What is that plant? Could it look more like this other plant? It reminds me of the nightmares I have. Whatever it is, it will mean something to someone else, and I might not be aware of it. And getting there through imagery is very helpful. So then by meeting 4, we've nailed down which of those kind of sprouting directions they like most, and this is when we can actually start introducing a color. And so for this one, similar to the last, we'll have 3 different directions of color. This is kind of showing how the 3 different color palettes could be used in different ways. So whether it's on paper, if it's on top of a darker color, can it still reflect something that's gonna like be legible? And then from here, we would nail down one of these directions to pursue until we finally get to the final deliverable, which we can then present in a final kind of like nice to look at package. Or this kind of goes to show the process in comparison to the modern kind of like trend of having websites where you can do very cheap. We didn't go through the therapeutic conversations process and get to understand truly what you wanted, and something that is legible and something that is going to be memorable. Because I could see any of us drawing something like this when we talk about, hey, could you draw this on paper and show it to someone and they could recognize it? This is going to be way harder to have someone remember exactly what's going on. It could be like, maybe the T was the tree T and not the doctor one. Or what's that flower doing there? I think it was next to the E. And it just gets way too complex. So in a lot of branding processes, it's always important to just keep it simple. And that's good for any good design. So then this is also where brands are used and how that same simple logo can show up in so many different ways and be powerfully remembered no matter where it is. And a great example that I keep going back to is Apple does a fantastic job of, it doesn't even have to say Apple anymore. It's just a logo mark that shows up on devices. It shows up on ads and you know it. They just say watch, you know it's the Apple Watch, you know it's the Apple phone. And so I like to try to have all of our brands pursue that level of quality where like you can, in time, it might not be the first couple of years, but eventually you get to a point where people have removed themselves from the name and then they can just recall the name based on this logo mark. I also have, I navigate away. Maybe not, I'll show it at the end, but I have like a branding package of kind of what a final deliverable when it gets into the entire print, when you get into typography and how all that's gonna reflect. Cool, so another icebreaker, and this gets into kind of expanding beyond, yeah, I know it's sad, getting beyond the initial just like, what's the logo? I personally have not worked with slogans too much, but I think it's a really powerful thing that in time, as your brand grows, slogans become more and more a thing that can help humanize any product. So similar to like the last exercise of going through and saying, in this case, McDonald's, I would love to know if you can recall what the different slogans would be for these, and if that level of human has like continued even beyond the name of the brand. So if you want to shout them out as I go through. That is one of them. Yep. I also like could not find the original logo in a good quality and found this one, and this one's like way radder. So I don't know like why they haven't attached this to their bags. I thought for the last one I heard V for Vendetta as an answer, and I was like, yep. Do they still say that on ads and stuff? Or is that just like my childhood brain? I don't watch TV. So this also, with the slogans, kind of created this world of having mascots in a way, where I personally knew somebody who worked at Progressive who was on the brand who came up with the Flo character and then was kind of stuck on this team because like if they got rid of her, they would lose most of their market because like their demographic became 60% 30 to 60-year-old women who are like, that is my security and I love that place. So they had the insight of that, and then he's like, I want to try something new, and they're like, if you try that, it will doom us all. So here are some of the ones over the last century or so. I mean, the Kool-Aid Man has become a joke, but I think he still shows up on stuff and he's rad. So mascots, I think, do a great job at advertising. Not again that I've done a lot of that realm, but as a brand consumer, I would love to delve into that kind of stuff eventually and come up with a mascot that can live beyond me. Because a lot of this branding talk is to do with how can you create something that if you leave the company or the company grows beyond you, how is it going to live beyond you, and are you okay with that? And I think like setting up these stones early on that are success can lead to that future success way easier. So that gets into when brands evolve and grow and what happens. So I think there's been a lot of recent changes and stuff, like Slack has recently changed and people saw swastikas and stuff. But anytime a brand changes, people get scared and they start getting frustrated with it for some reason. And it's basically down to like, how long does it take before people calm down? They're always going to be upset. But then like, is it a day? And they go, maybe I do like it. Or does it last 5 days? And then they're like, actually, I hate it. And then it lasts a lifetime. So Wendy's was one of those I remember, in which I personally think the new one's fine, but the immediate reaction of like, they took my daughter and I hate it now, was the reaction. What's anyone's feeling here around the Wendy evolution? Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I don't personally know anyone that works there, but it's super interesting to hear like this kind of insight of just feeling like it looks fast and it doesn't have the like, classic kind of like quality to it. Because I like kind of stopped eating Wendy's by that point, and by the time this happened, was like, yeah, whatever. I'm not like offended, but also I like the old one more. So it's a hard choice, but I think a lot of places that's like the weird, quick change that they look to like evolve their brand is like, we'll just do a logo change and then like everyone will love us again. Like, or you change your service and what you're producing and like what your product is and your voice and everything. It's not necessarily just your brand that's going to fix it. The Bucks did this, which some people seem to love and other people were frustrated with. Looks way more angry. Milwaukee's not full of angry, so. I love the hardcore punk version of Starbucks, but we are where we are, and I like the new one too. So this wasn't like the OG McDonald's, but it was the earlier, like maybe 2 iterations in. They've gone through like 12 logo changes, but clearly the one on the right stuck for way longer than anything else. I don't even know what that hash means. I think it's supposed to be like the roof of the drive-through that the old buildings used to have. Yeah. Also, as a fun insight on that, not that it has anything to do with Domino's brand per se, but I worked on a project there once. And they had a giant shrapnel thing in the backyard and a ton of bison. And we're like, what's up with the weird alien artifact in bison? He's like, when you drive by on the highway by that artifact, it looks like a cross, but we can't be like part of church as a big corporate company. So like we had to make this faux thing and the boss looks out the window and can see a cross, but no one else can. Also, he just loves bison, so he bought a bunch of bison. So that's Domino's. My love from childhood, another one was WWF. I don't like the one on the right pretty much at all. And I love the old metallic looking like spray. So they messed up. But now they're WWE and WWF gets a panda. So whatever. Kind of the most intense one that happened as a designer, I'm not sure if it really reflected back to the audience that we assume is kind of the one getting affected most, is Dropbox is a platform for anyone to share, but the design team there was given a huge amount of funding to kind of do whatever they want. So they had a lot of internal design work happening just for fun. And I knew people who worked there who just worked on stuff like screen printing, and they would just put posters in the office to be like, our culture is cool. So they ended up doing a whole rebrand recently. And when you look at it like this, it doesn't look very different. Kind of just, we made the Dropbox part a little spaced out. But then this was like the whole show that they had for like where their brand was going. But also remind you, it's a platform of just storing your files. So like, I don't know what this means necessarily to that. So from my experience, a lot of it just came out of like designers who are bored at a company who want to make something look cooler because they're bored, redid the Dropbox thing, but like with no, the customers weren't asking for it. They just wanted to do it. So I think some of it looks cool. I don't think it has any use for the company, and they probably could have used their money better. But like the old illustrations are this clean kind of soft line. The new ones are this wacky stuff that, again, I like fine, but most of the people I've met hate it, and they're the audience. So I feel like they're a brand that kind of forgot who their audience was, and it became a designer audience, and sort of pushed a lot of people away in doing this rebrand that was like so drastic, it scared people. And then they didn't get a lot of those people back. One of the brands that we at Clade worked on, that not as extensive as like a Dropbox, but I've had a lot of fun kind of evolving over time and retaining this like brand style and consistency, is Sulkin Raven, who's a musician that I work with in California. So we got to work with him on coming up with his brand through his logo, his color palette, and his character design. So think of like the Gorillas. It's kind of got that vibe where we came up with like a persona for him and what that persona is going to look like as it evolves through albums, as he gets into like live shows, things like that. So we came up with this character on the right that recently I talked with him about how he's going to dress up in those costumes potentially, and like the lights are going to reflect this stuff too. But this was like, it applied to the album itself. And this was the first album. So then the second album, he was like, I'm gonna be working on this like album with the producer from The Doors, and it's gonna have all these like funky guitars in it and stuff. So like, can we take that brand and evolve it to that? Still have it feel like Meats, Looking Raven. So kind of took it and put it this like California wash over it, but retained the character in the lion style, but started adding this like retro feel to it. And then he did a remix album. So I took that first one and kind of tweaked it into this like looking through glass feel, but the colors are still that very like neon pop. I'm also working on a new thing now, but I didn't have it like quite ready for this yet. But then as like brands evolve, you can get to a point of status that's like absurd, which is the Kleenex realm and the Band-Aid realm, where they are now just synonymous with the product they sell. So I think Kleenex, Ziploc, Coke, Band-Aid, anything where people will say like, I'll have a Coke, and usually 90% of the time say like, sure, Pepsi's fine. Or if they're really devout, they say no. So you get that kind of association where like they have dominated the marketplace, which is super interesting. I don't know if we've necessarily hit that in tech yet. Like Google, you can say Google it, but beyond that, a lot of it is still like open land. So why did we choose Clade Design as our name? Not why you should choose Clade. So the word clade comes from a group of organisms believed to have evolved from a common ancestor according to the principles of cladistics. And so in our research, we had a lot of potential ideas. We did a lot of our own market research. We treated ourselves like a client, which is usually the best way to get anything done. Otherwise, it gets real personal and nothing gets done. So we ended up landing on this feeling like we wanted to get back to our roots community and how we're gonna like reach out and like affect others and how they should reach out and affect others. So it's this like branching path network of how like we do good and everyone we're in attachment to will also do good, because if we have positive energy, it will all keep growing and we will grow a community. So that's kind of where the name Clade comes from. And as we move forward with the evolution of Clade, and we will eventually have 10-ish people on our team. This year, we're hoping to add 2 more people for a total of 5. But keeping that culture alive, since it is part of the brand, is kind of the next evolution for us to learn, because I've done branding when it comes to just like what's a mark, what's a name, what's like the tone of voice for this website. But how does the brand I'm part of going to grow as we grow? And do we keep like the same clients and don't scare them away? We don't scare our audience away. We don't scare the people we want to hire away, because now we're like big and corporate and we don't have that cool family vibe anymore. So I think this is kind of our mission statement, is like the Clade name is a good reminder to just always, the reason we got into it was to help and expand out to people. So in conclusion, I think the 3 most important things to keep in mind when you're dealing with your own brand is to keep it simple, direct, and memorable. And people often put little time and funding into their own brand, which should be the brand that you care for the most. It represents you, your employees, and all the people you work with or hope to work with. And care for your brand doesn't come quickly or without thought. It will live with you beyond you. It will adapt if you let it grow and bigger than you ever imagined. Make it simple, direct, and memorable. That way people can build a loving and honest relationship with you and your product. It should be easy to remember and a joy to share. Selling your idea and brand isn't hard when it's beautiful. Thanks. So now is questions. Do I do anything different for this? Okay. Okay, cool. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the question was, working in the wedding industry, all the brands are very wispy. And if your brand is going to be devoid of that, how far is too far? And is that going to affect your customers or anything? I think that is a kind of constant question that's being asked along all these lines of like being able to talk to your customers if you have users or people you've worked with previously and you can show some of the potential directions you're thinking of and get their immediate reaction. There is a weird sense of like, if you want to make change, it's always going to be scary. And so there's a certain level of adjustment that I think you can get away with where like instead of wispy, maybe you go for like, we're into structure and have a reason behind it where like instead of thinking of the love just kind of taking off way of wedding, it's more like the structure and foundation of like security and family. Then you could get away with like a serif kind of like bold Roman font or something that feels like structured but still like classical. But then if you went like full crazy like metal font or something that's like this doesn't fit the tone at all and there's no reason behind it unless it's for like that small kish of people who do like steampunk stuff or like whatever. But I feel like there is a small place where that opens an opportunity for you to kind of stand out still, as long as it's got reason, purpose behind it, and it does like reflect well in that industry. Yeah. So the question was, if a client shows logos that they really like, does that affect the process at all when it comes to, do we disappoint them in providing a logo that's not that good or not that exact thing? And I think that is also a really important thing to include of like, we always ask what are some brands that you really look up to and then kind of give us characteristics as to why. So if it's like we like the sleekness of it, we like how it's black and white because we don't want to introduce color necessarily, like those actionable items are really helpful. But if they're like we want to be like that because, like that's not really helpful. So if they say that, we can try to like direct them more towards like, but why do you want to be like that? Is it because of like how they treat their clients? Is it how they build their products? What about it is the reason you like that brand? So they're not just looking for like that logo mark. And that usually helps guide the conversation a bit more. Mm-hmm. So the question was, how do you kind of put an end to a logo and choose when it's actually finalized and not let scope creep destroy the process essentially? And that a lot comes from that beginning portion of the conversation of like, what's your timeline? Let's build around like this 4 week, 6 week, whatever it is, but we still constrain it to sort of force everyone into like, based on this, we should have 2 meetings a week and they should be like these kind of days. And that way we're like constantly being updated with each other. When if it's just kind of loose or like we have this end deliverable, we'll eventually get there. That's when it starts getting like, you're not talking often enough to make them feel secure in the process. But we do certainly have to deal with scope creep and stuff happening where like we get to the end and they're like, but maybe, what if this tail was a little different? And eventually you just have to say like, well, I trust you, you trust us, like this is a partnership. And if we really like can't see the trust in that, then we can like create a new kind of like SOW for like an engagement. But a lot of that conversation needs to kind of be like consistent, happen early, often, to try to reassure them like, you're coming to us, we'll provide you a great thing and you'll work with us, but like ultimately there does need to be an end. And this happens with like websites, apps, everything. They're like, but what if we add this? And you're like, well, for the MVP, so I think bringing up the thing where the brand can evolve too is really important. Of like, right now, this is a great starting brand, and I think it fits who you are now. Maybe 2 or 3 years from now, you want to like tweak it slightly, and that's okay. But at least you have something to like go to market with. Yeah, so the question was, how does the name like Clade showcase to the audience when without a definition, it sort of just sounds like a name? And I think that comes from how we act as a company. So like how we present ourselves, how we build our products, how we work with clients will showcase what that name means for. And I think for a lot of people, even if they do just think it's a name, the fact it's memorable, unique sounding compared to other companies, it's okay that it might not mean something to them directly, because then that name becomes us. So they see us as Clade and not necessarily the definition of Clade, but we become that as an item. Yeah, so to build the logo from the definition of what we see Clade as and who we are, it's a lot of kind of writing down lists of like, what do we want to achieve? Who are we? In the case of our logo right now, it's like the C with kind of the flip in it, which is more for like the way it's stylized is showcasing how we are, where it's like unique, the color palette's unique, and that stuff stands more for us than necessarily the mark itself. We didn't go the route of making like a character or anything like that, but it's something that like when seen could be connected to Clade. And we had that conversation too about like with Apple, where you have the apple and then it says Apple, or maybe down the line the C becomes something that's not a letter at all. But for now, it's like a good starting point of having the C and then using the color palette and the style it was treated reflect who we are and where we want the company to go. And like before, like I think it's okay that it will evolve potentially. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the reason we look at nouns instead of verbs or any other sort of words when working with a client is during our conversation, we'll come up with verbs, and that might be on the back of our mind. So they're like, we're action oriented, we're very fast about how we produce, we're passionate. Like these are all things that are things we know about the people. But when it comes to building out what the logo mark is, those aren't super helpful aside from just like knowing who they are. And it more comes down to like, all right, so you're passionate and stuff. What makes you think passion? And it becomes like a thesaurus game of like, cool, you can attach like birds or like what things are passionate, what things are energetic, what things are like reflective of those. And so if we can narrow that down in the meeting and get to the noun part, it saves us a lot of energy of trying to guess what they're thinking when they're saying those words. And then, but like those things do come up in the conversation. Yeah. Are there any questions on? Oh. Yeah, I'd say the research part. So the question was, when coming up with a name, when do you stop kind of scribbling down different names and actually start like nailing down which ones make the most sense? That's also kind of part of the timeline of like if we structure it where like the first week is research, we only give that week to come up with names. Kind of like if you're doing user testing and you say like we can get 5 users, but we're still going to know like a good percentage of how many people like or dislike a thing. It's like you're limiting your time to kind of limit the possibilities. So you can like come up with a lot of stuff and do intensive work that week. And then when you have that meeting with the client, you'll get a good sense right away as to like what they react to, what they don't react to. So you might write out like 60 things and only 6 get a response. And you're like, cool, these 6 are something we can like extrapolate on. Similar to like when you start drawing stuff and they're like, turns out I hate squares, but I didn't know I hated squares. Like seeing is believing, and it really helps guide a conversation. So do we have a process testing branding along the way besides the client? It's usually internally or like people we're friends with. So we have a Slack group where we just invite a lot of design friends that we really trust. And then they kind of under the like NDA realm of like friendship, will like send early directions for them. And it's weird because a lot of the time the thing they will love, we can then send to the client and the client will hate, and they love the one that like all the designers in the Slack group don't love. And then it's just kind of like ultimately they're the one paying. So you can be like, all right, now we know which two to present. So you can be like, this is the one all the designers that I'm friends with really support. Here's the one that the client really supported. Now we can like evolve these two and see if the client still sticks with that one. But you can also show that one that's like the client loved one to the designers in the Slack group and kind of get their guidance on the like how to like come to like a middle ground. But yeah, it's a lot of like friends in the industry being able to help give feedback along the way. Yeah, so one of our clients, ZetaGen, who's also in California in Berkeley, he specifically went back for like 2 weeks or a month to like show to other people in the industry of like medical research and just kind of get their feedback on like the colors and everything. So when he came back, he was like, this is great, but like we feel this line could be thinner because like it feels a little too cute right now, or like these colors are a little too like warm for the industry. Could we pull back to something cooler? And then we can just like totally do that for like a second evolution. But getting that feedback from the client who's like in a field that we're not necessarily in is super helpful. Because in a lot of ways too, like building apps or anything where they might say, this industry can't use this color because of this reason, we might just go in being like, yeah, it seems great from what we know, but they would have like a specific reason why this color gives a different connotation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question is branding the process between doing it for a person and for like a product. It does change in the sense that for a person, it's a very personal connection and it's just a one-on-one. And a lot of times it's their like their direct money. So the money is more limited in that sense where they might be a little bit more skittish, but they're also more passionate and like excited about the opportunity for like them to have a brand. So they're much more involved. When with a product, usually there's periods of time where they might not be able to make a meeting or something, and we have to actually corral them to try to make sure they like the other things are important for sure, but also like having these consistent meetings is important too. And then you might get like 2 of the 5 people that need to be there for a meeting, and they have to be like, oh, these other 3 people need to approve it, so send us the file and then we'll get back to you the next meeting. So there's like longer periods of time where you need to get more cooks in the kitchen and kind of like agree. And that's great for feedback, but it also can like slow the process. Yeah, so the ideal time to start doing a branding process in relation to the product is, I feel like getting the ideas to like who your market is, what your product's gonna be kind of reaching to accomplish long term, what kind of voice and tone you collectively as a company are already sort of organically starting to develop. All of that sort of helps inform. It's similar to, I've only done book covers once someone's given me the content in the book, because then I'm informed as to like what that means. When if I did a book cover without knowing what the storyline was, it's gonna not really make a lot of sense. So you do have to have an idea as to like what your product is, who your audience is, and who you as the company are. Because then we can do the Clade thing where like the 2 of us just sit down and talk about like, what are we trying to do here? Who's our audience? What are we accomplishing? And then that helps. And it makes it a way quicker process because you're not like, you're no longer the world's our oyster. It's like, cool, we're like sort of narrowed in. So what do I do about a brand where a company I previously worked sabotaged the brand I made? I sort of just had to, initially, I would feel pretty like upset, but this was years ago. And then I eventually came to a point of realizing like they have new designers, the new designers want to do something with it. The like people they're hiring change and evolve the brand itself. When I was there, the dynamic between people might be different than what it is now. So one of our recent clients and a continuing client that I used to work with is Dockyard, who like I came on and the designer friend I had who was the developer then had created their logo, but she's like, I can do design, but I'm primarily a developer. So then it was like, all right, you, Logan, like help reimagine this. It's been like 3 years. So I evolved it slightly, but I like passed it through her and through everyone who used to be there, get her approval. And she's like, looks great. Got the approval. I was there for 2 or 3 years, left. They've now since done like a little bit more to it, but like I trust the team is making the right decision and evolving it. Also, MailChimp just went through that where like they made Freddy look like slightly more cartoony and less like developer made structured or something. So, but when I talked to the team there, they're like, yeah, like I totally support it. Like they're different people than me and like go for it. I had my time. So as long as you can go with that. Way back. Yeah, so for co-branding in our past, we've done a little bit, but we actually have a few more co-branding projects coming up more recently. ZetaGen's kind of one of them where they're building a bunch of products off of that main product. And so early on, there was kind of that discussion as to how we were going to tackle it. And when it comes down to colors, that's when it gets a little bit more interesting because it also depends on like what the product itself is. So one of them is I'll give vague examples of what we're currently doing. There's like one that's a platform, and the platform might be like its own brand, but then all the subsequent portions that branch off of it, those could all make sense together. So if they all stylistically kind of make sense, then we distinguish them through color, but then the main brand is its kind of own thing, then like that helps unify them all. And I think having that stylistically, they look the same, but like the detail level or like the treatment and how they're applied to the different applications will help define those brands. But as long as all the separate brands in that situation are consistent with each other, it does a lot of the work for you.
1 o'clock, we'll hold it there. And thanks for everyone who is listening on the line. Is there somewhere people can reach you, or how should people reach you if they have more questions or want to hire you?
Sure. So you can find me at Clade.design, which is the website for where all of our goods are. We're currently redesigning it. Thanks to you, Sarah. Yeah, and email-wise, it's hello@clade.design. And you can find me and Sarah on Instagram. I'm Logan Ferber, pretty direct. So if you can find my last name, it's weird and it's Faer. But there's also Sarah Stu Artwork. And then the Clade also has an Instagram. And a lot of our stuff just funnels into that one also. They're all tangential. So we did our branding well because there's no other Clade design.
Cool. Thank you so much, Logan.